diving deep, really exploring the core values, the ethics, and yeah, the critical challenges within public administration. What makes this topic, I think, particularly compelling is how often concepts get interlinked. You see them mixing and matching. It demands a really holistic understanding. Our mission today, it's to sift through our sources, pull out those vital nuggets of knowledge on public service values and ethics. We want to give you that shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. We'll uncover some surprising facts, practical insights, basically help you gain clarity without feeling, totally overwhelmed. So let's unpack this. When we talk about civil service values today, it feels like a modern thing maybe. But that's really not the whole story, is it? These ideas, they have a surprisingly long history. Can you maybe walk us through that journey? Where did these values actually start?
Yeah, that's a great place to begin. And what's fascinating here really is that these fundamental values, they've been recognized since, well, ancient times. We've touched on thinkers like Plato and Aristotle before, right? They laid some early groundwork on good governance. But it's also definitely worth highlighting Confucius. He emphasized, proper etiquette, hierarchy, essential attributes for civil servants. And then you fast forward and you get Max Weber's pivotal concept of bureaucratic morality that really shaped how we understand modern public service.
Right. And then after World War II, we really saw this big shift, a modernization of public administration globally. And that brought new values into the spotlight, didn't it? Now you see them enshrined in big international documents like the UN Charter and national frameworks too, like India's Code of Conduct rules from '64. Plus, organizations like Transparency International, they're still championing these values, fighting corruption. But these aren't just like historical footnotes. Beyond the history, why do these ethics and values truly matter in public administration today? What's the real-world impact?
Well, if you connect this to the bigger picture, the significance of ethics in public administration today is just profound. It's the bedrock of public trust. Seriously, think about the digital services we use every day. Things like India's UPI payment system, or Aadhaar for digital identity, or direct benefit transfers, DBT. Millions use these platforms daily, often without even a second thought, right? And why? Because there's this implicit trust in the ethical administration behind them. That trust isn't just magic. It's built carefully on a strong ethical foundation.
Oh, okay, so trust is huge. What else?
Well, ethics also ensures decisions are fair, just, and impartial. Take the Election Commission of India. Their crucial role ensuring free and fair elections, where the Model Code of Conduct applies impartially to all parties. That's a prime example of ethics in action. It directly prevents bias, prevents corruption. But unfortunately, we do see stark examples where this fails. There was that 2021 batch officer caught red-handed in a corruption case just 2 years into service. So an ethical administration aims to prevent exactly that kind of thing. And furthermore, ethics enables decisions purely in the public interest. Remember, during the COVID pandemic, Indian Railways converting its coaches into COVID hospitals. That was just an inspiring example, showing a deep commitment to public service, putting the community first. So ultimately, ethical administration, it guarantees integrity and professionalism. These are just non-negotiables for effective governance, for public confidence.
That really paints a clear picture of the ideal. But okay, let's flip the coin now. Where ethics falter, problems, well, they inevitably pop up. From your perspective, what are the most pervasive issues, the ones that really erode public trust? And maybe share some recent examples that bring this home for us.
Certainly. I mean, one of the most glaring and consistent issues is, unsurprisingly, corruption. And beyond that officer I mentioned, we've recently seen this widespread unearthing of fake disability certificates, fake EWS certificates, implicating various officials. It's quite shocking. In 2024, the same Anti-Corruption Bureau in India made significant arrests. The ED, the Enforcement Directorate, they've been investigating a huge sand mining scam, and the Mahadev betting app scam in Chhattisgarh. It also points to some deeply rooted corruption. Oh, and there was the Maharashtra Bank scandal. 122 crores, that's what, 1.2 billion rupees, siphoned off by senior bank officials for personal use. These recent examples, they just highlight how persistent, how varied corruption can be.
Wow, those are some stark examples. What else are we seeing?
Another really significant problem is the lack of transparency and accountability. A housing allocation scam recently unearthed in one Indian state really highlighted this absence of clear accountability. And think about the tragic pattern of frequent stampedes we've seen. Hathras, Delhi Railway Station, Prayag, that RCB sports event, the Allu Arjun event, Tirupati Temple. In these incidents, officials were often, held responsible on paper, but was genuine accountability enforced on the right individuals? It leads to questions about impartial application of the rules.
Yeah, that accountability piece feels crucial.
It is. And what's particularly striking is that Ghatkapar Advertisement Board collapsed in Mumbai. killed 16 people. This board was massive, Guinness World Record size apparently, yet the BMC, the local municipal corporation, claimed afterwards it lacked permission.
How is that even possible?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It raises serious questions about awareness within the public authority. How could a structure that huge exist without proper oversight, without accountability?
Right. And what about political influence?
Yes, political interference and bureaucratic inertia. In many Indian states, political interference in transfers, postings of IAS and IPS officers, it's a clear breach of political neutrality. It completely undermines the impartiality the civil service is supposed to have. Then there's nepotism and favoritism. They still persist. The Adarsh Housing Society scam in Mumbai is still, a classic example. Officials misusing their positions to benefit relatives or friends.
And just basic inefficiency.
Absolutely. Inefficient service delivery. There was that distressing example of a lady stuck in a correction home for a year or two just because an inefficient, unresponsive clerk failed to do their job. And that non-performance of duty, by the way, that itself is a subtle form of corruption. All these issues, they often lead to pervasive bureaucratic red tape, creating needless delays, frustration for citizens. And taken together, these problems often create complex ethical dilemmas for the public servants themselves.
You mentioned ethical dilemmas, and that leads us perfectly into, well, a really fascinating and often challenging area, conflict of interest. It feels like a critical concept, constantly testing the boundaries of ethical public service, and it has such profound real-world relevance. This is where it gets really interesting, right?
It absolutely does. Conflict of interest, or COI. The Second Administrative Reforms Commission in India defined it, quoting Senator Fulbright actually, as a situation where an officer breaches the spirit of law, but not the letter. And that's crucial.
Why crucial?
Because it highlights why COI is often this tricky gray area.
Yeah.
It's so hard to resolve because technically no direct law might be broken, but that ethical line, it's definitely crossed.
Okay, so how does it actually happen? How does it materialize?
Well, COI happens when a primary interest, which for any public servant should always be unwavering loyalty to the public interest, gets overshadowed or overtaken by a secondary interest. That could be loyalty to family, friends, personal financial gain, you name it. Think about that 2024 case study example. Sneha's on a tender committee, right? And her own brother bids for a big government contract. Her primary interest should be getting the best quality and price for the public. But her secondary interest, loyalty to her brother, creates this really clear, really uncomfortable conflict.
Yeah, you can see the problem immediately.
Right. And interestingly, both ancient thinkers like Kautilya and even Machiavelli believed that mixing personal and professional relations inevitably leads to COI and ultimately corruption.
So it's not just about obvious corruption then?
No, exactly. The insidious power of COI isn't just, outright bribery. It's how it subtly erodes the very foundation of meritocracy in public service. Decisions get based on personal gain, not the genuine public good. And this isn't just about individual failings. It leads to systemic inefficiency that impacts every single citizen. It violates fundamental principles like transparency, objectivity. And if you think about it, it directly undermines things like Nolan's 7 principles of public life COI, clashes directly with selflessness, honesty, accountability.
So we're talking about a subtle erosion that affects everyone. What does this look like when we examine real-world examples? Can you give us some concrete cases?
Oh, there are many recent and compelling examples. A classic one. A public servant owns shares in a company. That company bids for a government contract. The servant then uses their position to award the contract to that company so they profit when the share price goes up.
Textbook case.
Textbook. And another really clear COI was when the owner of the Chennai Super Kings cricket team was also the head of the BCCI, the cricket board in India. The potential there to favor his team's players for national selection. Obvious conflict. There was also an alleged COI involving a former finance minister in a government deal where his son had financial interests. The argument was the minister really should have recused himself from those specific discussions.
And more recently?
More recently, think about the Hindenburg Report fallout. SEBI, India's securities market regulator, actually formed a committee specifically to check for COI before appointing board members. That's a significant step, a reaction to past issues. Another striking case, the NIDCO project in Greater Nicobar. The managing director of the corporation pushing the project was also the commissioner-cum-secretary for environment and forest for the island, right during the project's clearance phase. That's a direct conflict right there. And remember, late 2024, Byju's, the ed tech company, owed the BCCI something like 15,000 crore rupees. They end up settling for just 158 crore. India's Supreme Court actually stepped in and questioned a potential COI, demanding clarity on that, let's say, unusual deal.
Those examples really do highlight how pervasive COI can be, sometimes in places you wouldn't immediately expect. So, okay, what does this all mean for actually tackling such a complex, often subtle issue? How can we effectively prevent or resolve these conflicts of interest?
Yeah, it's tough. Resolving COI, it really needs a multi-pronged approach. Organizations have to build an ethical culture right from the ground up. They need to clearly define what actually constitutes COI within their specific context, provide ongoing awareness, training, and implement robust systems for monitoring, yes, but also for reward and punishment. Clear guidelines for gifts, donations to public servants, that's crucial too.
What about codes of conduct versus ethics?
Oh, good point. There was a direct question on this in a recent exam, actually. It highlighted the challenge. See, codes of conduct, they're codified, written down, easier to enforce. But creating a universally acceptable and enforceable code of ethics, that's much harder. It really emphasizes that while rules are vital, individuals ultimately have to be driven by their own ethics, their values, their conscience.
And recusal, just stepping away.
Recusal from cases, yeah, it's an option. But it's often seen as a last resort. Sometimes it can even look like an abdication of responsibility, which, well, it presents its own dilemma, does it?
It does. So maybe clarify the difference between actual and potential COI.
Right, vital distinction. An actual COI means the conflict has already materialized, it's happened. For example, say a friend calls their old batchmate, who's now on a public service interview board, asks them to look after their son. If that board member actually takes action based on that call, influencing the outcome, that's actual COI. A potential COI, though, hasn't materialized yet, but the situation could be misused. Like maybe a government department head's daughter applies for a job at a company that's a major supplier to that same department. No action might have been taken yet, but the potential for influence, or even the perception of influence, is there. And that perception itself can be really damaging to public trust.
That distinction is really helpful for understanding the nuances. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Moving beyond these specific problems like COI, let's talk about the even trickier area of ethical dilemmas. Those situations where there isn't an easy right or wrong answer, but maybe a clash of positive values.
Exactly, and that's an important distinction right there. An ethical dilemma involves a conflict between, say, two positive values, whereas an ethical issue is usually a clear problem, like outright corruption or breaking a law. The hope is, if you resolve a dilemma ethically, it doesn't become an issue.
Okay, so can you give us some types of dilemmas, maybe with examples?
Sure. Let's explore a few common types. First, right versus right. This is often where the real struggle is. Imagine a doctor's duty to patient confidentiality versus the need to inform an HIV patient's spouse for the spouse's safety. Both confidentiality and safety are positive, valid values. It's a tough call. Then there's wrong versus wrong. The classic example is the trolley problem, right? Any choice you make results in a negative, undesirable outcome. You're choosing the lesser of two evils. Right versus wrong is usually clearer. It's a conflict like, say, a senior officer ordering an unethical act firing on unarmed protesters, maybe versus a public servant upholding their integrity and refusing that order. How about individual versus society? Think about a farmer using pesticides. It increases their crop yield, that's their individual economic interest. But the runoff might cause a public health crisis as the negative impact on society.
That pesticide example is clear. Any more recent ones?
Well, a more recent, quite debated example is the Uniform Civil Code in the Indian state of Uttarakhand. It makes it mandatory for live-in relationships to register. This poses a dilemma, doesn't it? Between individual choice, privacy, and societal dictates or norms around marriage and relationships. You also see organization versus individual. This often plays out as tension between an organization's drive for profit, maybe, and an employee's need for work-life balance, mental health. Means versus ends is another big one. Remember President Trump being seen with that ex-terrorist figure? The potential end goal might have been political influence, diplomatic stability in the Middle East, but the means chosen. Highly questionable from an ethical standpoint. Right, does the end justify the means question? Exactly. We also see conflicting values, especially in the media. The dilemma between reporting the truth accurately versus engaging in sensationalism just to get higher ratings, higher TRP. We see this visibly with fake news spread during conflicts. Facts get sacrificed for clicks or views. Limited resources versus competing demand. This is a constant in public service, isn't it? Think about crises. Essential goods like vaccines, hospital beds, oxygen. They're in limited supply. Who gets served first? How do you ensure fair, equitable distribution? Huge ethical challenge. And finally, technological advancement. AI, digital expansion, does it truly lead to utilitarian benefit for everyone? Or does it accidentally make existing social and digital divides even worse? It really highlights the need for a human-centric approach, right? To prevent, as some say, science without humanity.
That's a great range of examples. What about dilemmas specific to public administration itself?
Yes, absolutely. This brings us to a really critical dilemma, especially for anyone in or thinking about public service: administrative discretion. We mentioned the coal scam in India earlier. That's a prime example. Officers were alleged to have used their discretionary power to favor certain private companies, causing huge financial loss to the government.
And speaking of the coal scam, there was that really significant development just this year, 2025, wasn't there? The Delhi High Court acquitted 6 people, including the former coal secretary H.C. Gupta. The court said the CBI just failed to prove corruption charges. Despite the reputations being damaged, years lost. The court found no actual crime. What did that ruling mean for this honest mistake versus dishonest crime dilemma?
It's a powerful illustration of exactly that dilemma. Think about it. How can public servants make decisions in good faith, using their necessary discretion, if they face severe consequences, prosecution, public shaming for outcomes that might be beyond their direct control, even if those decisions weren't actually corrupt?
So it creates a chilling effect.
Precisely. It leads to this crucial question for future public servants. Will they risk taking decisions in good faith, aiming for efficiency and public benefit? Or will the fear of punishment, fear of failure, general risk aversion, will it lead to more bureaucratic red tape? Could it transform them into what the philosopher Hobbes might call a self-preserving man, someone who just strictly follows the letter of the law of self-interest to protect themselves rather than following the intent of the law for the public good? That ultimately stifles innovation, efficiency, doesn't it?
It really could. Are there other specific dilemmas common in public service?
Oh, definitely. Beyond discretion, dilemmas are rampant. There's the individual dilemma around corruption itself. Do you blow the whistle if you see it? Or do you fall in line, maybe even become part of the system to survive or advance? There's the tension between secrecy, often required under things like the Official Secrets Act, and the public's right to information, especially relevant now with India's RTI Act completing 20 years. That's a constant conflict. Nepotism, too, not just actively participating, but sometimes facing forced nepotism, where a senior officer pressures a junior to engage in favoritism. It puts the junior in an impossible position. Information leaks are a huge concern now in our digital age. Think about privacy, confidentiality. We've seen data breaches from systems like Aadhaar. Managing information ethically is a big dilemma. And finally, the policy dilemma. This is about the conflict between a public servant's personal beliefs or values and their sworn duty to implement government policy, even if they strongly disagree with it. Imagine a deeply pro-environment official who's tasked with overseeing the clearing of a forest for a development project. That's a tough internal conflict.
That's a lot to navigate. In all these complex scenarios, from the mundane to the massive, where do public servants find their footing? Which brings us, I suppose, to the concept of conscience, our inner guide, maybe our moral compass.
Exactly. Conscience. You could describe it as an intuition, a moral sense, yes, that inner voice that guides us. And, when you follow it, it often brings this deep sense of joy, of fulfillment. But if you go against your moral compass, well, that can lead to deep remorse, guilt, and what psychologists call cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it's like having a split personality almost. You can almost visualize it, right? Like seeing a mirror image of yourself, arguing with yourself. That represents the inner conflict when your actions don't align with your conscience.
So this raises a big question, one that's been debated for centuries in philosophy and governance. Is conscience actually a more reliable guide than formal laws, rules, and regulations?
It's a huge debate. Thinkers have offered really varied perspectives. John Locke, for instance, he was kind of ambivalent, suggesting it may or may not be reliable. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, argued pretty strongly it's not a reliable guide. Why? Because he believed conscience is shaped by society, by our upbringing, and it's susceptible to self-deception, to external influence.
Okay, so not reliable for Sartre. Others?
Well, St. Paul, thinking theologically, believed it was reliable. And Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, went even further. He stated conscience was reliable and must be followed by all. It was a categorical imperative for him.
What about Indian thinkers?
Good point. Indian thought also weighs in. Dayana Saraswati, for instance, emphasized having no inner split as a sign of true moral integrity, and Mahatma Gandhi famously said, there is a higher court than courts of justice, and that is the court of conscience. You put conscience right at the top.
So for public servants navigating all those dilemmas we talked about, how does conscience actually help in practical decision-making?
Well, ideally, conscience plays a vital role. It helps in avoiding corruption, resisting nepotism. It promotes transparency, encourages making judicious use of public resources. It pushes for human-centric development, not just hitting targets. And crucially, maybe most importantly in large bureaucracies, it helps challenge groupthink and conformity, that pervasive yes-man culture where independent ethical thought gets suppressed in favor of going along with the crowd or pleasing superiors. A strong conscience can be a bulwark against that.
Okay, so we have the inner compass, the conscience. Now let's unpack this further. How do the formal frameworks, the laws, rules, and regulations fit into this whole ethical landscape? How do they complement that inner guide?
Right, so laws, rules, regulations. They're distinct, but they're definitely complementary. They form the external structure, the guardrails, for ethical behavior. Let's break them down. Laws. These are the formal legal statutes framed by the legislature or parliament, state assemblies. They're broad in scope, defining what's legal or illegal for everyone, and they're enforced by law enforcement agencies, the police, the courts. Rules. Now, rules are more specific. They're usually guidelines created by government departments or ministries to implement the broader laws. Think of them as the operational details. They're enforced by departmental or administrative agencies. A good example is the DPDPA, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act in India. The act was passed, but the specific rules for how it works in practice took time to be notified. Those rules are essential for implementation. Regulations, these are even more targeted. They're issued by specific regulatory agencies, bodies like SEBI for the stock market, or IRDAI for insurance, or TRAI for telecom. They address very particular issues or sectors. Think about the upcoming OTT regulations for streaming services. That's a specific regulation for a specific industry, and they're enforced by those same regulatory bodies.
Okay, so distinct levels, but working together.
Exactly.
Right.
All three, laws, rules, regulations, they share the overarching purpose of ensuring law and order, preventing anarchy, providing a framework for society. They work in tandem to guide ethical conduct.
And how do they specifically ensure ethical behavior? Can you give some examples?
Sure. They do it very directly. For instance, India's Right to Information Act, RTI, celebrating its 20th anniversary, by the way, so maybe something to watch, actively promotes transparency. Transparency is a fundamental ethical value, right? The law mandates it. The Lokpal rules, establishing the Anti-Corruption Ombudsman, now marking their 10th anniversary, they're designed to ensure accountability in high public office, another core ethical value. The Competition Commission of India, CCI, its job is to ensure fairness in the market, preventing monopolies, unfair trade practices. Fairness is key. The Consumer Protection Act safeguards the public interest by empowering consumers against unfair practices. And SEBI regulations, like the recent guidelines for finfluencers, those financial influencers online. They aim to ensure ethical governance in the financial sector, protecting investors from misleading advice. So you see, these frameworks aren't just abstract. They're explicitly designed to guide and enforce ethical behavior in the day-to-day work of public service and beyond.
That makes sense. Okay, let's try to apply all these layered concepts, the values, the problems, the dilemmas, conscience, the rules, to a powerful, unfortunately common, real-world case study, a building collapse. These events seem to tragically expose so many of these ethical fault lines at once.
Yes, they really do. So imagine this scenario based on many real incidents. A building gets permission for, say, 3 floors, but then it's illegally extended, maybe adding several more floors without approval. Then the worst happens, it collapses. A number of innocent laborers die, and often these include women and children. Now, the very mention of children on a construction site immediately flags potential Child Labor Act violations, right? And raises profound questions about who is responsible, who failed in their duty of care, accountability failures right there. And often, these laborers are migrants, maybe from different places, adding another layer, a crucial societal dimension of vulnerability. They might lack local networks, be less aware of their rights. Then, the typical response. The government quickly announces some cash relief for the families. The builder gets arrested, at least initially.
Okay, that's the scenario. So what does this all mean beyond immediate tragedy? You mentioned accountability failures, vulnerability. What are the deeper systemic reasons these incidents seem to keep happening year after year, despite the arrest, despite the relief money?
Yeah, we need to look beyond the obvious. These incidents reveal really deep systemic issues, and they link back directly to much of what we've been discussing. First, the illegal extension itself. That points to a likely nexus of corruption and negligence. A clear breach of existing laws, building codes, regulations. Someone looked the other way or was paid to look the other way. Second, as we said, a profound accountability failure. Why were children on that site? Whose responsibility was it to ensure safety standards were met, to enforce labor laws? It's often diffused or ignored. Third, the migrant element is crucial. It points to the broader societal issue of vulnerable populations who are often exploited, lack proper protections, and become the tragic victims of these systemic oversights. Fourth, that immediate cash relief. While it seems helpful, and maybe it is in the short term, it often acts as a diversion. It quells public outrage temporarily, but it prevents a deeper dive into identifying the root causes, pushing for real systemic reform. It can even create this sort of accepted norm. A payout happens, and the underlying problem is forgotten.
So the relief almost becomes part of the problem.
In a way, yes, it can mask the need for fundamental change. And finally, the cycle of impunity. In reality, influential builders involved in these collapses. They're often released on bail fairly quickly. The cycle of violations, illegal constructions, cutting corners often repeats because accountability is rarely truly fixed on those ultimately responsible. No strong deterrent example is set. So tragically, it almost becomes an accepted, dangerous norm in parts of the construction sector, undermining the rule of law itself.
So given that grim picture, what measures could actually prevent a recurrence? How do we break that cycle?
Well, it requires action on multiple levels, case-specific actions. Obviously, strict enforcement of building plans from the start, aggressively exposing any nexus between corrupt builders and complicit officials. And critically, fixing accountability directly, not just on the builder on paper, but on any involved organizational personnel, any officials who failed on their supervisory duty. Policy and regulatory measures. We need to really emphasize and strengthen the role of bodies like RERA, the Real Estate Regulatory Authority, in ensuring compliance before things go wrong. And maybe controversially, we need to argue for much stricter bail conditions for those deemed responsible for such fatal violations. Make bail the exception, not the norm in these cases, to create genuine deterrence. Ethical and systemic solutions. This is the deeper level. We need that deep surgery I mentioned to identify and tackle the root causes, rather than just relying on the band-aid of cash relief. Setting powerful examples by ensuring swift and meaningful consequences is paramount to creating deterrence. This means actively promoting transparency, integrity, and professionalism within the entire administrative and regulatory system. Again, it comes back to embedding those Nolan principles, selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, into the culture.
That's a powerful and comprehensive analysis. It really shows how ethical failures in one specific area, like building regulation, can just cascade outwards into these huge societal problems with tragic consequences. Okay, to wrap up our applied ethics discussion today, let's look at one final sector where ethical challenges seem constant. Journalism, often called the fourth pillar of democracy, but it faces its own ethical minefield, doesn't it?
It certainly does. In journalism, we see several key ethical issues that consistently and worryingly undermine public trust. There's the pervasive problem of paid news and fake news, the deliberate spread of misinformation, which can destabilize society, influence elections, you name it. Sensationalism is another big one. Driving TRP, those television ratings, often seems to happen at the expense of truth and accuracy. Sometimes it even leads to outright false claims being made, especially during conflicts or crises, just to capture eyeballs and clicks. Cross-media ownership is a structural issue with ethical implications. When large business houses, sometimes with close ties to the government, own major media outlets, it can significantly influence news narratives. This can lead to bias and response polarization, where media actively shapes public opinion towards particular political ideologies instead of providing objective reporting. There's also the misuse of social influence journalists or media personalities, leveraging their platforms for personal gain or to push undisclosed agendas. And underlying all this, journalists themselves often face a crisis of conscience, real dilemmas between reporting the truth as they see it and facing pressures from owners, advertisers, political actors, or even just the pressure to sensationalize.
So, a lot of potential pitfalls. What are the solutions? How can journalism navigate these challenges more ethically?
Well, solutions are critical if journalism is to fulfill its democratic role. Some key measures include implementing robust, fair laws and regulations for the media, finding that balance between freedom of the press and responsibility. Crucially, addressing cross-media ownership to ensure greater independence and diversity of voices. Preventing monopolies is key. Strong adherence to a clear, well-defined media ethics code within the profession. Promoting diversity and inclusion within media houses themselves, ensuring varied perspectives are represented, which can help reduce unconscious bias. Establishing clear accountability mechanisms for media personnel and organizations when ethical breaches occur. Ensuring transparency about ownership, funding, and potential conflicts of interest. Independence is paramount. And finally, encouraging rigorous self-regulation and, perhaps most importantly in the digital age, thorough fact-checking before news is disseminated. This is absolutely essential to combat misinformation and start rebuilding public trust.
This has been a truly illuminating discussion, really digging into the core of ethics in public administration.